Hey guys, welcome to Life with Steph. I am Steph. So today we are going to be going over John Edward Robinson. If you don't know who he was, then stick around to find out. So John Edward Robinson was born December 27th, 1943 in Illinois. He was the third of 5 children. His parents had issues, to say the least. His father was alcoholic and his mother was a disciplinarian. So he was born in 1943. Come 1957, he became an Eagle Scout, traveled to London with a group of the scouts that he was with, and he actually got to meet Queen Elizabeth II, which ended up being a pretty big deal back in the little town that he was from. Later in 1957, he ended up enrolling in Quigley Preparatory in Chicago, which was actually a private boys' school for boys that were aspiring to be priests, but he ended up dropping out. In 1961, he enrolled to Morton Junior College, also in Illinois, and he planned to become a medical x-ray tech, but he also dropped out of that. He dropped out after 2 years. Come 1964, he moved to Kansas City, and there he married Nancy Jo Lynch. They had their first child in 1965, John Jr. Then in 1967, John was followed by Kimberly, their first daughter. Then they had twins, Christopher and Christine. They were born in 1971. In 1969, so a couple years before the twins were born, John Robinson was arrested for the first time in Kansas City. He embezzled $33,000 from a medical practice. He had actually gotten a job there as an x-ray technician, and he did that by using forged credentials. Once he was arrested, he was sentenced to 3 years probation. Then the next year, in 1970, so 1 year before his twins were born, he violated probation because he had moved back to Chicago, and his probation officer had actually not given permission to do that. While he moved to Chicago, he ended up taking up a job as an insurance salesman. 1971, he was arrested again for embezzlement. He embezzled firm funds, and then he was ordered back to Kansas City. Once he was there, his probation was just extended. And in 1975, his probation was extended yet again because he was arrested again. This time, his charges were fraud, securities fraud, and mail fraud. Apparently, he was in connection to some phony company that would claim to be a medical consulting company in Kansas City. John Robinson had this appearance that he was very much a family man, all about his community. So he did a good job at maintaining that persona. So he was actually a scoutmaster. He was a baseball coach and a Sunday school teacher. So he did really good at making it appear that he was all about his town, his family. In 1977, he joined the board of directors at a local charity organization, And he pretty much talked his way onto this board, forged some letters that were supposedly from the mayor of Kansas City, civic leaders, and they were all saying how generous he was, his volunteer efforts, pretty much saying that this was an amazing man. So eventually, once he joined the board of directors, he had himself named Man of the Year and pretty much threw a party in his honor. Couple years after that, in 1979, he was finally able to complete probation. Yay! In 1980, he was arrested again. His charges included embezzlement and check forgery. This time around, he ended up serving 60 days in jail. He was sentenced to that in 1982. After he was released, he came up with another fake business and ended up getting $25,000 from a friend. And this friend was actually, his wife was dying, and he pretty much promised a fast investment return. And so his friend gave him the money so that he could pay for his wife's health care. Then in 1984, he started 2 more fake businesses. Now there, he hired Paula Godfrey. Paula was 19 years old, and she was hired to be a sales rep. So Godfrey ended up telling friends and family that her boss was actually going to send her away for training. Now, after she went off on this training, people stopped hearing from her. Her parents stopped hearing from her, and they ended up filing a missing persons report. The police did question Robinson, and he denied knowing anything of where she was at. A few days after he was questioned, her parents did end up receiving a letter that was typed, and then it had Paula's signature at the bottom. Now, this letter was actually thanking Robinson for having helped her out. She kept insisting that she was okay and didn't want to see her family anymore. So the investigation was actually closed. Paula was 19, so she was of legal age, and there wasn't any evidence that there was anything to suspect, so they ended up closing the investigation. Months after Paula disappeared, Robinson ended up meeting Lisa Stacy, and Lisa had a 4-month-old daughter, Tiffany. Lisa was actually staying at a shelter for women in Kansas City, and Robinson promised to help her get back on her feet. He put her up at a roadway inn. A few days after he put up Lisa, Robinson ended up contacting his brother and sister-in-law, who had been attempting to adopt a child. So Robinson contacted them and informed them that he knew of a baby that needed to be adopted, and so he pretty much assisted them and charged them $5,500 in legal fees. His brother and sister-in-law received the baby. They received adoption papers, which were later proven to be forged signatures of 2 lawyers and a judge on these adoption papers. And later on, Tiffany is tested and she is found to be Lisa's daughter. In 1987, Catherine Clampett, she was 27 years old, She had moved to Kansas to find work. She had a child and left her child in Texas. So Robinson actually ended up hiring her and promised her that they would travel and she would get all these new things, new clothes. She ended up vanishing in June of 1987. From 1987 to 1993, Robinson was incarcerated. First in Kansas, he was there from 87 to 91. He had multiple convictions for fraud. And then in Missouri, he had also convictions for fraud and his parole violations. When he was at Western Missouri Correctional Facility, he ended up meeting Beverly Botter. She was a 49-year-old librarian that worked in the prison's library. And when Robinson was released from prison, she ended up leaving her husband and moving to Kansas to work for Robinson. Now, once she arrived in Kansas, Robinson did arrange for all of her alimony checks to be forwarded to the Kansas post office box. And shortly after that, her family never heard from her again. For several years, her checks continued to be forwarded to this post office box, and Robinson continued cashing them. So by this time, the internet was, coming up, and people were starting to use quite a bit of it. He was roaming social network sites, and he was using this name called Slave Master. He was looking for women who would play the submissive partner role. And one woman did end up responding. This was Sheila Faith. She was a 45-year-old mother, and her daughter was 15 years old. Now, her daughter, Debbie, was actually in a wheelchair. She had spina bifida. So Robinson was playing this part of a super wealthy business owner, and he actually ended up offering to pay for Debbie's medical expenses and offered to give Sheila a job. So in 1994, Sheila and Debbie ended up moving to Kansas City from California, and they immediately disappeared. Faith was receiving pension checks, which Robinson continued cashing for the next 7 years. In 1999, continuing this BDSM persona, he offered a job and a bondage relationship to Isabella Lewicka. Now, Isabella was 21 years old. She was a Polish immigrant, and she was living in Indiana. She did end up moving to Kansas City, and supposedly, even though he was still married to his wife, Robinson ended up giving an engagement ring to Isabella. They ended up going to the county register, paid for a marriage license that was never picked up. She had told her parents that she was actually married, though she never told them her husband's name. But it's not really well known if she did in fact believe that they were married, or if she was just telling her parents that. She did sign a contract, a slave contract with Robinson, and it pretty much gave him control over every single part of her life. which included her bank accounts. Around the summer of 1999, she did end up disappearing. Robinson started a rumor that she had actually been caught smoking marijuana and had been deported. Around that time that Isabella disappeared, we have a Suzette Troughton, who was from Michigan. She had moved to Kansas, and she was actually a licensed nurse. And so she moved to Kansas with Robertson on the arrangement of being a submissive sex slave for him. Her mother did actually end up receiving several typed letters that were signed by her daughter. However, her mother always claimed that these letters were not actually from her daughter. They were mistake-free, and it just did not seem like her grammar, her spelling, even though it did have her signature at the bottom. Later on, Robinson ended up telling Suzette's mother that supposedly Suzette had run off with somebody and had stolen money from him. So as time went by, Robinson did start to get careless with his way of finding victims and also with covering his tracks. By 1999, he had fallen on the radar of authorities in Kansas and in Missouri. His name was being brought up in more than one missing persons case investigations, and as time went by, they started being able to connect his name to more and more of these cases. Now, come to June 2000, a woman ended up filing a sexual battery complaint against him, and another woman charged him with stealing her sex toys. So he ended up being arrested at his farm in Kansas due to these charges. So because he was already on their radar, these were the perfect opportunity for investigators to obtain search warrants. Once they started searching is when they ended up discovering everything. So on his farm, they ended up finding the decaying bodies of two women, Isabella and Suzette. They were in two 85-pound chemical drums. Now, in Missouri, another investigation was going on, and they ended up searching a storage facility where he was renting two garages. And there they found three similar chemical drums to the ones that were found in his farm. And they contained the bodies of Beverly Bonner, Sheila Faith, and Debbie Faith. All five women were actually killed the same. They were killed by one or more blows to the head with a blunt instrument. In 2002, John Robinson went to trial, first in Kansas, for Lisa Stacy's murder and the murder of two other women. During this case, there were more than 23,000 pages of police reports, supposedly, and more than 100 witnesses. John Robinson killed all his victims. It seems that his weapon of choice was a hammer. The authorities did end up recovering about 18 hammers from his properties, and they did examine them, but they were never really able to pinpoint which of these hammers were used as murder weapons. On October 29, 2002, the jury delivered a guilty verdict. John Robinson was sentenced to death in January 2003. Now, after his Kansas trial, then he was moved over to Missouri. In Missouri, he was made a deal. He was offered a deal. If he pled guilty to 5 murders, he would avoid the death sentence. Now, they did this in hopes that Robinson would end up revealing locations of 3 of the missing women who hadn't been found yet. He ended up accepting the plea deal, but he gave no information in exchange. Currently, he is 76 and still on death row in Kansas, and he is actually appealing his death sentence. So he is actually known to be responsible for 8 homicides, but his victim tally is still unknown. And here is a quick summary of his victims. So 1984, we have 19-year-old Paula Godfrey, whose remains have not been recovered. 1985, we have 19-year-old Lisa Stacy, whose remains have never been recovered. 1987, we have Catherine Clampett, 27 years old, remains have never been recovered. In 1993, we have 49-year-old Beverly Bonner, who was discovered at the storage facility in Missouri. In 1994, we have 45-year-old Sheila Faith and 15-year-old Debbie Faith, both of who were recovered at the storage facility in Missouri. 1999, we have Isabel Lewicka, who was 21 years old. Her remains were discovered at the ranch in Kansas. And in 2000, we have Suzette Troughton, who was 28 years old, and she was discovered also in the ranch in Kansas. So there we have it. There we have this serial killer who has still kept his secret where 3 other women are. He's still alive. He's still on death row, trying to get out of death row. Let me know what you guys think. Have you guys heard of this one before? I personally hadn't. So it was crazy to, be reading up on him and getting all this information. Please be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, share this video, and you can follow on my social media. It's linked down below, and I will see you guys on the next video. Bye.